welcome back to CS128 Honors. In this lesson video, we're going to talk about control flow in Rust. So what is control flow? Control flow is conditionally and repeatedly running code, and it's one of the most important things that you can do in a programming language. And Rust has similar syntax to any other language that has control flow, with if, while, and for loops, as well as its own type of loop called just a loop. So let's talk about if statements to start off. Rust uses if statements to conditionally run code, and what that looks like is just like below. So we declare a variable and then we create some sort of condition or Boolean value. So in this case, we're saying if the temperature is greater than a certain temperature, then we are printing that it's hot out. And for those of you who were here on campus last week, you'll know that it was very hot out last week. So in this case, it's going to print it's hot out. Now, what if we don't want to run that code and instead we want to run some sort of alternate code if this condition fails? Well, just like in other languages, all we have to do is add the else statement, and what this does is it runs if all the other if statements fail. So in this case, if the temperature if the temperature were 70 out, you would see it's not too hot as opposed to it's too hot out. So let's talk about an important difference with conditionals. Rust requires that if statements evaluate a Boolean, which allows for no mistakes to happen due to implicit conversion. And to see what I mean by implicit conversion, let's take a look at some C++ code. So looking at this code below, you see that we have an int temperature and it's set to 60, and then we have this if statement that just says if temperature. And then we say it's hot outside if that's the case. Now, believe it or not, this will actually evaluate to it's hot outside in C++. And the reason is because we have that if temperature. And C++ will say that any non-zero integers are true. And this can lead to a lot of problems and programming mistakes because people don't realize what they've done on accident. Whereas in Rust, we're able to solve for this. So if we look at some Rust code, you can now see that what happens when we try to evaluate this is that we get a compiler error telling us that it expected a Boolean but found an integer. And if you wanted to check for the integer to be equal to 0, all you'd have to do is do equal 0 or not equal to 0. And just like in other languages, we have the else if, which allows us to evaluate multiple conditions before falling through to the else statement. And as you can see here, if the temperature is below 70, then you'll get it's too cold out instead. So let's talk about loops. In Rust, there's the loop statement, which will just continue to repeat some code until you stop running the program or until you use a break statement inside the loop. And so what that looks like is it will just continue printing something out depending on what you're printing. And this is a very simple example, but if you wanted to do something more intense, like say a calculator, all you'd have to do is just put all of your code inside that loop, and then after you finish, say, a calculation, you could then start back at the top of the loop automatically. Now, just like in Java or C++, the while loop can repeat a loop until a condition is met. And so what that looks like here is we have this number 5, and then we say as long as that number is not equal to 0, continue to print, and then once we're done, we're printing liftoff. And this, as you can probably tell, is just a simple liftoff countdown counter. And so when we try and run that, you'll see we get 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 liftoff, and it works exactly as we expected. But one important thing to see here is that we have to manually keep decrementing 1 every time, as opposed to having a for loop do this for us. So let's take a look at a for loop in Rust. So the for loop, on the other hand, will allow us to iterate over a known set of values or a collection. So for example, in this case, we have for number in 0 through 10, and then we have this print statement, and then prints count to 10. So this is very similar, and the biggest difference for those of you who haven't come from Python backgrounds is this new in 0.10 syntax. And what that essentially means is that it starts at 0 and will go up to but not including 10. So this would be similar to saying for int I is equal to 0, I is less than 10, I plus plus. All you're doing here instead is you're changing that to be a little bit of a more succinct form. And so when we try and run this, we'll get 1 through 10 and then count to 10. So in summary, in this video, we talked about how control flow is used to let the computer make choices for us and to help us not have to copy code. And we showed how to use various different statements like if, loop, while, as well as for loops, and showed each of the different scenarios where you might want to use them. Thanks for tuning in for this very short video on loops and other types of control flow in Rust. In the last video in this Rust 101 module, we'll be talking about I/O in Rust.